There's a lot of people involved in this project, in particular John Innes, who sort of leads the work that I'm involved with in Hamilton. Hopefully you'll pick up from this some of the linkages between the pest side of things and the plant side of things. So who are these predators? Well, if you ask Google, it might suggest we've got problems with extraterrestrial predators and stuff, but we don't have to worry about those even in Hamilton, fortunately. We're also not talking about native predators. That's a New Zealand falcon, and we're not talking about those when we talk about predators. Predation is a natural process. If it's done by native predators, that's all good. The ones we are interested in are the rodents. It's a shiprat, brush-tailed possum, and mustelids. That's a green woodpecker. We don't have those in New Zealand. This is it's an amazing photo. It was taken just on the edge of London in the UK, and it's legit as far as I can tell. The BBC's reported on stuff, and that's a weasel going for a ride. Weasels are one of the 3 mustelids we've got in New Zealand, the others being stoats and ferrets, and they are incredibly powerful for their size and tenacious and very good predators. I don't like the chances of that woodpecker surviving. The other amazing thing about this photo is how stupid the internet goes when something like that turns up. My favourite, I think, being Weasel Knievel. So what we're talking about is the introduced mammalian predators, and we're interested in their. We know a lot about them and their impacts in native systems, because that's where all the work's been done so far. This is an example of what they do. So that's before I start the video, that's a fantail sitting there on its nest. It's night time, it's pitch black. It would be pitch black to us anyway. And just watch what happens. So there's a slight pause there of about a minute where the fantail knew something was happening, so it leaves the nest. And then this comes in, and just watch the way it comes in. This is a shiprat. It doesn't even come in on the biggest stem. The biggest stem is probably less than a centimetre, but it doesn't need that. It can just, the finest of twigs, they can get along, and they get anywhere in the canopy. There's virtually nowhere in the canopy that shiprats can't get. 2 chicks, kills them both, and runs off with one. And that's happening every night all through our forests where there's, these predators are not being controlled. And of course our native birds, they evolved with predation, but predation by native birds. They have very poor defences against predation from introduced mammals. And this, I'd like to be able to show you a video of a native parakeet, but I haven't got one. They're not very common on the mainland. But so this is a rosella, eastern rosella, that you see quite a lot. They're introduced in New Zealand. And this video is looking down the top of a dead tree fern stump. So looking down inside the hollow stump, that's places that rosellas and starlings often like to nest. So this is just a clip in the daytime, it's colour in the day, and then just to show you who the bird is and stuff. And then we go to black and white at night. And again, it senses something's happening, something's approaching, so it gets out of the way. There's 2 chicks, I think, in the nest, and an egg still remaining. There was a period in New Zealand's history where people seemed to know that possums ate birds' eggs, and then we all forgot about it. And then John Innes and others sort of in the 80s and 90s were doing this video work again, and on kokako, they put video nests on kokako, video cameras on kokako nests, and you could see that possums are not just folivores. They don't just eat leaves and flowers and fruit. They also take birds' eggs and chicks. So basically, introduced mammalian predators reduce indigenous dominance. And indigenous dominance is just a fancy way of saying that we want things being done by native species. We want native species present, and we want the processes that happen between them to be dominated by native species, rather than those exotics. So if you think about those green circles on the right, that's all our native reptiles, birds, plants and inverts. They all interact with each other. That's kind of, if it's all happening with native plants and animals, that's good indigenous dominance, but we've got these predators, these introduced predators that are interacting with all of those in different ways and upsetting things. So in restoration, we often want to have more of those things on the right, more indigenous dominance, and we typically do that by trying to get less of those things. That's a pretty simple equation that's been applied a lot in natural areas in New Zealand. But urban predators are not so well known, and they're likely to differ from those rural and wilderness areas. This is a paper you won't be able to read, but it doesn't matter. Di Morgan and Joe Was from Waikato University and John Innes did this back in pre-2009, and they basically found that apart from cats, which are super abundant in cities, there are relatively few of those rats and mustelids, which you would expect to find in a natural system. So they are different systems. Now this diagram has got a lot on it, but don't be too intimidated, I'll try and talk you through it. It's a diagram that John and I did for the Cape to City project over near Napier, over in Hawke's Bay a couple of years ago. And it's essentially just showing the interactions between some of the predators and some of the birds that are present over there. These birds start in the middle here. These are the birds that they're kind of interested in restoring. And each bird is preyed on by multiple pests. And we've ranked the order of the pests by how important they are. So the wider the line, the more important the pest is for that species. And those kind of feed back to this side, and all those lines add up. And it shows that overall, for all these different birds, stoats come out as as the worst. And that is because they can impact everything. They're not always the worst for each bird, but they can pretty much get anything. They're important for everything. Ship rats are right up there as well, and although they don't affect some of these birds down here, they are the main predator of a lot of these forest birds that we're trying to recover. Another thing about this graph is that for some species you have to start talking about pets. Cats and dogs are on here. If you want to recover brown kiwi, you really have to have something dog control in place. You could probably have kiwi here in downtown Tauranga if you got rid of the predators, including dog control of some sort. So that's just a conversation that sort of, at some stage, people will need to have, which is already happening with cats, as you probably know. The other thing on this plot, on this chart, is that there's some native predators on here. Harriers, black-backed gulls and pukeka are all native predators. Each of those is probably more abundant now than it ever was before humans got here, and they still have an impact, but overall they're not the worst. Maybe for some species they're particularly important. We've also got, there's two rats on here. There's ship rats and there's Norway rats. And you'll notice straight away that they're in very different places on the side there. Ship rats are the little rat that was in the video earlier. They're arboreal, they're up in trees, they're incredibly good climbers, and they are pretty much ubiquitous. Norway rats are the ones that live around your compost bin and around drains and along the coast and stuff like that. They don't climb anywhere near as well, so therefore they're not such a big problem for these birds that are nesting up in trees. They are a big problem for birds that nest on the ground, like New Zealand dotterel and saddleback, which is a forest bird, but it's a bit of a strange one in that they roost in holes, they nest in holes, they roost in holes, and in fact I've seen them just roosting at night on the ground. They're really stupid in terms of avoiding predators like that. This last part of the chart over here is just some of the other management options, management interventions that would be needed perhaps to help restore some of these birds. This is a rural sort of landscape, so in an urban place here you would need to reconsider what your objectives are. You wouldn't obviously be recovering some of these, and you wouldn't have to deal with some of these pests. But one thing you do notice over here is planting comes up quite a lot. So we've focused a lot in the past, well, sort of say pre-80s, and that habitat loss was a major problem that ended up with people like Stephen King climbing trees at Poriora because the forest has been cut down so rapidly that soon there'd be no trees for kokako. It was pretty simple. You won't have kokako if you don't have forest. But that sort of clearance has largely stopped, and so then the big focus was on predator control. Because of these problems, people realise that predators are a major problem. Maybe we've almost gone a little bit too far now, and people have forgotten that these birds still need habitat. So we need to start looking at connecting some of these fragments that are left and making sure we've got appropriate food supply. And that doesn't just mean just kawhai, so you've got tui in your garden in October. It's thinking about what those birds need for the rest of the year and the other birds that maybe just need invertebrates and stuff. Another reason that we're sort of interested in urban predators is because Claire Freeman and Yolanda Van Heesek are also involved in the People Cities Nature Project, and this is a paper they published a few years ago, with a first sentence of the abstract pretty much sums it up. Domestic gardens offer immense potential as sites for native biodiversity conservation. And this is another paper James Russell and John and co published, and this is talking about the predator-free New Zealand concept, where they identified that sort of maybe counterintuitively, large urban areas might have a head start on as pest control hubs because they've got more volunteers, they've got probably limited pest habitat, and that's based on that work that Di Morgan did some years ago. This is Stephen Hartley, who's involved with this work, his sort of pictorial of basically what we try and do in urban restoration with pests. It's a bit like that, when I said we want to get more biodiversity benefits, more indigenous dominance by pushing the predator numbers down. They sort of map. So if you've got fewer predators, you expect to get more biodiversity benefits. If you've got lots of predators, you can have fewer biodiversity benefits. And we do that through the pest control side. So more pest control, we'd like to get fewer predators, so we get more biodiversity. But these don't map straight across. You can't actually say that if you do this amount, you're going to get exactly this response, which is going to have exactly this effect on the birds. They don't map across. But we've got, a bit of an idea. So this is back to this diagram again. And so we want more of that, fewer predators, but remembering that these don't map directly across, so it's really important to measure the residual abundance of those and not the effort that you put into it necessarily. It's really tempting and really easy often to just measure, we put out so much poison. But you don't actually know if that poison had any effect on the predators. And even if it did have an effect on the predators, we're still not measuring the biodiversity outcome, which is ultimately what we're interested in. What we're interested in is getting more birds or more plant regeneration or whatever. But measure that if you can, but at least measure this because it's a step closer than just the effort that you put into the pest control. It's also important to consider scale and connectivity in these sort of restoration activities. This is an awful map of Hamilton's there. For those of you who know the Waikato, hopefully this is reasonably familiar. So Hamilton, Cambridge and Te Awamuru's down there. This is some work that we did over 10 years ago now, where at the time tui were very rare in Hamilton. They visited in the winter, then they disappeared in the spring, and they weren't seen again until the next winter. So we caught some of the few birds that visited, and we put radio transmitters on them, and we found that they're all basically heading out to forest areas. The few that look like they've stayed in cities were just that the transmitters died before we found where they ultimately went in the spring to breed. So they're going back to native forest to breed. So they weren't, they weren't staying in the city. So the regional council, Waikato Regional Council, started a pest control operation. They called it the Halo Project in some of those forest areas around the city. They started then about 2007, and on the y-axis here, you've got mean number of tui per 5-minute bird count, which is a standard way of sort of indexing or measuring the abundance of tui. And you can see that the top line here is the winter visiting birds in green areas being our parks and stuff like that. and you see it shot up quite spectacularly. Now tui are so abundant that people are almost complaining that they're keeping them up. The other two lines are also interesting, but you'll notice there's a bit of a lag. That line there is just the November birds, so those birds are breeding. So we now have birds breeding in the city because they're staying through the breeding season. And interestingly, this is residential area, so this is people's gardens, and that's November again. So we've basically got people, with tui breeding in their gardens in summer. So essentially what we did is we recovered tui in Hamilton City by doing pest control 15, 20 kilometres away, which may not have occurred to people, as the thing to do at the start. So you need to understand that connectivity between areas that these birds are using. This is another figure that John and I did for the Cape to City work, and it's basically those bird species that they're interested in. Go back to it. Looking at how far each of these moves across the landscape and how far they'll cross gaps, because quite often these birds will move a long way through good continuous habitat, but they get to an edge and they won't cross dairy paddocks, for instance, or they might not cross water. But how far they go differs for different birds. And what you see is there's a group of, keep pushing that wrong button, there's a group of birds here that don't go very far at all. Saddleback, whiteheads and robins, maybe 100 metres. 300 maybe for riflemen and brown kiwi. They don't go that far. So if you're trying to restore these birds into a landscape, you really need to start thinking about connectivity. And people talk a lot about corridors and things like that, but it's important to remember that corridors are species specific. So you have to think about, what am I making this corridor for? Because if you're making a corridor for tui, I'll try not to do that again, tui and bellbirds, your corridor might consist of patches 15 kilometres apart, and that may act as a corridor because they can do more than 20 kilometres. Tomtits are kind of in the middle, they'll maybe do 3 kilometres, and these other birds here on the right, they're basically not limited by gaps, so they can pretty much go anywhere. So you don't have to worry so much about connectivity at all for those ones. It's the habitat at the end that's important. So this is the work that we're actually doing in the People Cities Nature Project. The research aim is number 1.3, and it's titled Understanding and Manage the Unique Predator Profile of Urban Habitats, because inadequate understanding limits effective management. We're working in 5 cities. 3 of those cities, Hamilton, Wellington and Dunedin, we're working in throughout the duration of this project, and we're monitoring pests twice a year in each of those. 2 of those 2 extra cities, Tauranga being one of them, the other is New Plymouth, we are planning to do a single round of monitoring just to sort of help bolster our sample size without having to put in so much effort, because we don't have the resources to do those the full time. So we're hoping to do those in May next year. What we're doing is we are measuring the abundance of these key mammal pests, possums, rats, remembering that we've got 2 types of rats, ship rats and Norways, and we're hoping to be able to distinguish between those a bit with some of our camera traps. Cats, hedgehogs and mustelids. And we're doing this in 3 different habitat types. So we're doing it in residential areas, which is literally people's gardens, front gardens often, and amenity parks, which are sort of more your margins of your playing fields and things like that, with sort of smaller scale plantings, and natural areas, which differs between the cities, because in Hamilton we don't have very many mature patches of forest, so we're using a couple of those, and some of our others are more recent sort of replanted areas. I think in Dunedin they've got more mature forests. I'm not quite sure yet. We're still scoping out where we'll be in Tauranga, so I can't tell you exactly where we'll be here yet. And we're using safe tools, because we don't want children getting their fingers, whacked or things like that, or pets getting damaged in any way. And we're using consistent methods across all these cities, because if you measure things differently in different places, you can't compare them. And we've actually, our little group working on this, we've been mocked relentlessly and mocked and ridiculed by some of our colleagues for how much time we spent talking about whether the peanut butter should go at the end of the tunnel or in the middle of the tunnel. But the standard operating procedure is that it goes at the end of the tunnel. So it's important to do it. So if you're only comparing your own data with yourself, you can put the peanut butter wherever you like. But if you want to compare your results with any other work that's been done or work that might be done in the future, stick to the protocol. So we're using tracking tunnels. I've set for 1 night for the rodents, and mustelids, they're set for 6 nights using arrays, which is just a rabbit bait. Ground up rabbits, basically. It's commercially available. And we're using chew cards for possums, and we've got trail cameras set as well. So although I said use consistent methods, we have to, this is one thing that we do allow ourselves some slack on, because you can't, the protocol says straight lines of 10 tunnels at 50 metres, and we can't physically fit those into some of our spaces. So we curve them around through the habitat. This is one of our amenity sites. This is Hamilton Lake Domain. We're also hoping to have replicated pest treatment and non-treatment areas, so that we can compare some of the biodiversity outcomes from those different regimes. And we'll also be able to say a little bit about what those management tools that we use in those areas actually meant for the pests that were left, how many were left. And we're measuring the bird nest success and using wetter motels to monitor wetter and some other inverts in those patches. And another part of the People Cities Nature project is looking at lizards, and they're doing that in our same sites. So we'll hopefully be able to say something about those. So have all of you seen tracking tunnels before? Or a few nods. They're widely used around the country now. I've got a few of the cards here with tracks on that I can show you later if you're interested, but they're basically just a plastic, black plastic tube, about 1/2 metre long, 10 centimetres square, and you put an inked card in them, baited at the ends, and critters walk through and leave their footprints. They're good at picking up rats, those are mice, those are humans, and that's a hedgehog. Chew cards are just little pieces of core flute that are now commercially available, and you can get them preloaded with peanut butter or not, but easy to get them preloaded, and you just literally staple that to a tree. Things come and chew on them to eat the peanut butter, and you can identify them from their teeth marks. They work best for possums. That was actually designed for possums, and we're probably going to use them just for possums, although some people do interpret them for other things like rats and hedgehogs and stuff, but it gets quite complicated. The trail cameras, we'll have 2 trail cameras on each of our lines, simply because they're a lot more expensive. A tracking card costs $1.50, and one of these costs about 100 times as much. And of course they just give us nice black and white pictures at night under the infrared light, and nice colourful pictures in the daytime of people and dogs and stuff. But that's typically what we find. We have the cameras pointing at the tracking tunnels. One of the issues with cameras is that there really isn't a standardised method for deploying them yet. Like things like how high, what angle, what you use as a bait, how far away it is, that sort of thing. But we are standardising within our work that they are basically 1/2 metre off the ground, pointing at a tracking tunnel about 2 metres away. So that's how we're using them. So the results that we've found from this work so far, and it is only very early, we've got another couple of years of sampling to go, but we could sort of sum it up and say that rats and mice and hedgehogs are the most abundant of these critters in town. The highest rat densities we're finding in our forest and amenity sites, which is probably not too surprising, and the highest mouse densities in the amenity areas, which I thought was a little bit surprising. So that's more the margins of sports fields and that sort of thing, the less diverse natural areas. Possums are very scarce in Wellington, so this is one of the interesting things. So cities can be quite different, and that's probably because they've got a lot of possum control in Wellington. And mustelids are very scarce across all the New Zealand cities, and that is probably because of the superabundance of cats. Cats will kill and eat them, basically, and also there's lots of dogs and things. So it's not the same as in a natural native forest area. So we have to think about things a bit differently, maybe. This is the more verbose version of what I just told you, I suppose. So we've got loads of possums in Dunedin in their natural areas. That's probably what you'd expect to find in a natural forest area without possum control. But no possums virtually at all, maybe a little blip there. I think there was one possum recorded there in Wellington, somewhere in between in Hamilton. Rats, and we can't differentiate from the tracking tunnels whether they're ship rats or Norway rats. I should point out the index on the left is on the y-axis is just the number of devices tracked over that time period. So rats are generally actually pretty low throughout, to be honest. If this was a North Island unmanaged forest, you'd expect rats to be up about 80, 90, 100%. So the numbers are actually relatively low. There are a lot of hedgehogs, though. So another part of the work, as I mentioned, was this looking at the biodiversity outcomes specifically. And we had a couple of students, Alan and Natasha, last summer, looking for bird nests around Hamilton and just monitoring the fate of those. So, how many were successful, how many failed, etc. They managed to find 27 nests. We've got another student this year who's cracking along. He's got another 30 or so nests. So by the end of this project, hopefully we'll have a decent sample size. It's quite difficult to find birds' nests, but hopefully over the duration of the project we'll have a decent sample size. The majority of them are exotic birds, mostly blackbirds and song thrushes, as you'd probably expect in an urban area because that's the most common birds. Of those nests last year, they found 63% were successful. And that's pretty similar to other work that Di Morgan did in Hamilton, where about 50%, and Yolanda van Heesek found in Dunedin, similar number. And it's significantly better than you get in wild, unmanaged forests. So in those native forests, we know that in unmanaged areas, birds are typically not doing so well. Some birds can get by on that sort of level of predation, they sort of hold their own. Others do far worse and they peter out and they disappear. What we're hoping to do next is see an intensification of the pest control at some of our sites. Ideally half of them, but we know that there's all sorts of limitations around this, so we'll see what happens. And then we're going to compare the biodiversity outcomes in those different areas, so before and after in the treatment and non-treatment areas, and just see when we do flick that switch, do things change a bit. And in Dunedin, they've got, sorry, that's Wellington. In Wellington, there's the Miramar Peninsula has been possum-free for quite a few years, apparently, and now they've got their predator-free Miramar project where they hope to eradicate all the other nasties from that area down there as well. So that'll cover some of our study sites and we should get really interesting results from that. Dunedin has just recently been funded for the Predator-Free Dunedin project, so that's going to be interesting there. And in Hamilton, we have a Predator-Free Hamilton Trust, and they've already started doing some work up at one of our sites and they're going to keep doing that and intensify that for us. And the Regional Council has supported us, will support us next year with traps to go into another 3 of our sites. So we have 4 in total that will have an increase in pest control. And we'll be using just good nature H12s and A24s for possums and rats in those. So this is probably the part that you're actually most interested in, managing these things. And unfortunately, this is the part that I can probably say the least about because it is fairly early still, and there are a lot of complex health and safety and probably legal issues that I actually honestly don't know anything about. It's not my area of expertise. I can mention that there are a lot of other people problems as well, like people pinching your good nature traps and taking your trekking tunnels and throwing them in the river, and graffitiing your trees. I don't know, we have a lot of graffitied trees in Hamilton for some reason, and people from other cities are quite impressed by it, but maybe they have a better class of citizen, I don't know. What I can say is one of the most important things is to identify your objectives when you're doing this sort of work. It's actually much harder than it sounds, and a lot of big projects around the country struggle with this. You know, what is it that they actually hope to achieve? But it's actually really important because you have to think about all those other things, like what pests do you need to target? What other issues are involved, like connectivity and food source and that sort of thing. So do try and do that. Timing of your pest operations matter, and of course that depends on your objectives. If your objectives are spring nesting birds, then obviously you need to do your pest control in spring, or at least have your pest numbers low in spring. If it's ground nesting birds, you need to target a different suite of predators. You need to think about Norway rats and hedgehogs. If it's lizards, maybe it needs to be year round, and it probably needs to include hedgehogs. If it's roses, you know, possums. Monitor the outcomes, not the work. And use standard or at least consistent methods. And yeah, sort of watch this space, because that's the sort of thing we're working on now. I was always told not to apologise for your cooking or your slides, but I'm going to have to apologise for this one because it's got way too much on it. But we're often asked for advice on, okay, so what can we do now? What should we be doing? And it's a bit too early, to be honest, to be able to give you definite sort of guidelines on what you should or shouldn't be doing. But this is what we've sort of recently produced for people in Invercargill who are interested in. So, you know, there's some standard monitoring techniques you can use for pests, like, you know, 1 night tracking tunnels for rats, and 6 or 7 nights with rabbit meat for rats and hedgehogs could work. 2 cards for possums. Don't worry too much about the spacing, that sort of thing. But sort of watch this space. We're going to we're working on this, and when we do have those, you know, when we can say a bit more about those things, I'm sure it will be distributed to interested people, and I'm sure that it will go on the People, Cities and Nature website as well as other places. So yeah, stay tuned.